Oh, yes, when you people see a mysterious object undulating before the lens of my world famous cheap ass camera, you know that it is time for another episode of the Malcolm Tent Shoot interview. That's right, baby. It's me, Malcolm Tent. Man, this cheap camera just won't quit. So as long as it's functioning, I'm functioning. As long as I'm functioning, I'm going to bring you, my frantic fans, loyal listeners, and vibratory viewers, the complete truth about whatever it is that is a complete truth to be told of. And I'm not going to tell you who my guest is today just yet. I'm going to go back a little smidge and give you guys a bit of personal history about yours truly. And you might have heard this story before, but you've never seen the actual AV materials. For me, the current problem began sometime around, let's say, October of 1978. And I strolled down to the local drugstore as I would every couple of weeks, every couple of days, whatever, looking for the latest comic books and also the latest issue of Cream magazine, because Cream, very important magazine, very effective for brainwashing. And yay, the drugstore had the latest issue, and it was this one right here. And it's typical Cream. It's got the Who on the front, it's got Kiss on the back. Yeah, read through it a little bit, and oh, there's, I got some Leonard Skinner there, and oh, leaf through it a little bit more. There's, the dude from Fleetwood Mac. It's Cream. They're doing their thing, but Cream, as we know, was always very subversive in their own way. So I'm flipping through, looking at the record reviews of, like Linda Ronstadt and Journey, and there's Alice Cooper, and all right, more Who, more Kiss. And all of a sudden, I flipped to this one page, and I saw something there that caught my very young, not yet jaundiced, but willing eye. Right there on this page next to David Johansen was this very odd full page ad for this thing. What is this? Are we not men? We are Devo. Devo, the important sound of things falling apart. I didn't know what it was. Didn't understand a word of it. Didn't know what the hell was going on there. But somehow at the age of 13, I knew I needed it. I knew it. I needed it. So soon thereafter, maybe even the very weekend after I bought that magazine, my family went on our usual trip to the Westland Mall in Hialeah, Florida, where Specs record store was. And wouldn't you know it, through the wonders of the Warner Brothers distribution network and all of the muscle that they could flex, Specs Music in Hialeah, Florida, with their little tiny itty bitty cute little punk rock section, had about 6 records in it, had that album. They had the album. I couldn't believe it. There it was. It was even on display. $6.49. I just about burnt the back of my hand reaching into my pocket to grab that money. Took it home, listened to it. That was it. That was it. Whatever it was, whatever genetic code was waiting to be unlocked was unlocked on that fateful Sunday afternoon. I learned that the name of the band was Devo, not Devo. And there was an entire universe to try to understand and decode and come to grips with. That was 42 years ago, kids, and I'm still working on it. And so I am absolutely delighted, dead chuffed, virtually resurrected from the grave of mediocrity to have today as my guest on the Malcolm Tent Shoot interview, one of the original architects of the idea, the aesthetic, the reality of Devo. I want to welcome aboard right now, Mr. Bob Lewis. Hello, Bob.
Hello, Malcolm, and hello, Spuds. It's nice to be here.
Really nice to have you here. This is, to me, is a rare opportunity because I interview a lot of people, a lot of, rock stars, if you will. And what I'm always interested in doing is getting something besides the official story. Like in the story of Devo, we already know. We know the official story. We know the official history. You can interview Jerry and Mark of Devo, and you pretty much know what they're going to say, but we don't know what you're going to say. And that, to me, is really, that's where the meat of the matter lies. So we're going to start this off by saying, by the way I experienced it, Devo landed in my life as a complete construct. It was like a meteor becoming a meteorite and landing amongst us hairless monkeys, a fully realized thing, but with no explanation, no antecedent, no nothing. So that works really well when you're dealing with a construct, but it doesn't really work that well when you're talking to and about the people who helped to conceive of the construct and birth it and nurture it to get it ready to be in this wiggly world of ours. So Bob, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and where you're from and when you were there and how it made you Devo?
Well, I'm from Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, which is a suburb of Akron. And at the time I was born, through 1978, really, Akron was still the rubber capital of the world headquarters of Goodrich and Goodyear and Firestone and General and Mohawk and Cyberling and other tire companies nobody's ever heard of. So there was a class of like engineers and intellectuals in Akron, but Devo doesn't really come from Akron. It's a product of Kent State. And I think that in order to understand the various vectors that made Devo possible, you gotta go back to, we've just come out of World War II. The economy is booming. And the GI Bill is sending people to college that never would have gone to college before. And the Veterans Housing Program is allowing people to buy homes that never would have been able to own a home before. And the economy was filled with money. A guy with a high school education could go to the rubber shops, or he could go to the auto industry, and he could make enough money to buy a home in the suburb and have a car, and his wife didn't have to work. She could stay home with the kids. And, you know, it's the America that Reaganites want to go back to, even though, you know, it was never as idyllic as they thought, but there was plenty. And so at Kent State, it went from being a small, basically teachers college of maybe 5,000 or 6,000 students to 20,000 students in about a 6-year period. We're talking from the early 1960s to say 1967. And so they had to expand the faculty to handle all these students. And they hired a bunch of smart young professors. And they had a core of professors there that were really well-known nationally, if not internationally. They had a guy named Howard Vinson, who was the world's leading authority on Melville. They had a guy named Bernie, what's his last name? I can't remember his last name, but he was a Joyce scholar, very well regarded. And then they had these new guys like Robert Berthoff and Tom Hines, and he was, Berthoff was into American poetry. And then there was a guy in the art history department named Charles Swanson, who had gone to Black Mountain College. For people who don't know, Black Mountain was an experimental college that ran in Black Mountain, North Carolina from, I'd say, the late 30s through the late 50s. And John Cage was there, and Buckminster Fuller was there, and Charles Olson was there, and Ed Dorn, and Robert Creeley. And just, if you look up Black Mountain, you see there was a stunning intellectual horsepower assembled in this little town. Well, somehow some of those people got into Kent. And there was a pretty vivid intellectual scene, art scene in Kent. And there was also a music scene there. I mean, at one point, maybe two of the best guitar players in the United States were playing uh, 4 nights a week for $1. Joe Walsh was there with the James Gang, and Phil Kagi, who later became a Christian guitarist, but a fantastic guitar player, had a band named Glass Harp. And then there was a guy named Bob Kidney that I went to high school with. And Bob Kidney, he had flunked out of school and he joined the Navy, and he got stationed at the Great Lakes Naval Station in Chicago. And on weekends, he would go down to the South Side to the blues clubs. And he got to know a lot of the blues, Hound Dog Taylor and those people. And then he got booted out of the Navy, and he came back to Kent and started a band, the Numbers Band, started in 1970. They're still going 50 years later. And then he was responsible. He knew some club owners in Kent, so they started bringing in blues musicians. So we had Hound Dog Taylor and people like that coming to Kent to play. So there was a music scene and an art scene. And then we had throw in some visiting scholars like Eric Mottram, who was from King's College in London, and Eric kind of adopted Jerry and me, and we took a course of his, and in the syllabus for the course, there was a lot of information was being poured into our brains, and most of it was concerned about the place of mankind in society and the place of mankind on Earth, and what were the intrinsic problems of humanity. And at the same time, then there's also the war in Vietnam going on, where you have this cognitive dissonance between what the government is telling you was going on and what you can tell is going on from what you see by opening your own eyes. So, and then of course, everybody was concerned because when you graduated, then you didn't have your student deferment, or if you flunked out, you didn't have your student deferment, or if you didn't have 16 hours a quarter or a semester, you flunked out, and then you got your draft notice, and here you go to Southeast Asia. So you had the anti-war protests also. And then you had a pretty competent and enlightened art department there. They had a lot of really good professors and a core of like graduate assistants who were working on their master's degrees, but were also teaching like freshman classes that the people like Jerry and I got to interact with. Now, as an accident of geography, Kent is on the major east-west trade route. If you drive from New York City to Chicago and then to LA or San Francisco, you drive through Kent, Ohio. You can't avoid it. And it so happens you're just about 8 hours away from New York coming west. So anybody that was going back and forth was stopping in Kent. So there was a lot of, we knew about Andy Warhol, and we knew about the Velvet Underground and stuff like that. And so there was a group of artists and musicians that, for the size of Kent, was really kind of remarkable. A lot. Chrissy Hine was involved in that, and Chris Butler from the Waitresses, and Walsh, and then there were also people like Bruce Hensel, who became a recording engineer and recorded at Criterion Studios and stuff like that, and Patrick Cully, who wound up working with Frontline Management on the West Coast and helped manage the Eagles and stuff like that. So a lot of people in the music and entertainment business were involved. And then there was another friend of ours, the summer of 1966. In June, my brother got married, and his wife still had 1 year at Northwestern in Chicago. So I helped. So they moved into a little apartment in Evanston. And so I drove along and helped him move in and move furniture and stuff like that. So that night, I'm looking for something to do. And I said, well, maybe I'll just go down to Old Town, which was at the time kind of Chicago's Greenwich Village. So I drive down to Old Town and I'm walking down the street and there's a sandwich board on the sidewalk that says Exploding Plastic Inevitable Show. And I didn't know what that, but it was only $3 to get in. So I said, well, you know, let me see what's going on. So I walk in and there's the Velvet Underground with the full Andy Warhol multimedia show. And now Edie Sedgwick and the other girl that used to dance with the Velvet Underground stayed in New York. So the Velvet Underground hired a couple of local Chicago girls to wear these tinfoil dresses and dance with the band. So between sets, I'm talking to this one of the girls who was dancing, and her name was Peggy. Well, oddly enough, that fall, she shows up at Kent State in the art school, and she was a friend of Jerry and mine. And so she was another kind of important personality in this kind of like stew of art and intellectual showboating. And so, and the art and music scene there was very cooperative. When the bands would play in Kent, they would like loan each other equipment and stuff like that. It was only later when we started playing in like Cleveland or New York where, you know, the whole thing of don't touch our equipment, and if you're the opening band, we're only going to turn the volume up so far, and you only, you know, you don't get the full lights and all that kind of, you know, all that kind of stuff. That didn't really exist there. There was this kind of magic moment in time. And so it, you know, it was kind of an idyllic situation. And then May 4th happens. And, you know, the bloody turd in the punch bowl. So, I mean, I hadn't graduated yet, but I had taken all the anthropology courses, undergraduate courses available. So I'd started taking the graduate courses, and my plan was, you know, after I graduated in June of 1970, then, you know, I was going to keep going and get a master's and probably a PhD in anthropology and go to Africa and dig up bones. That was really kind of what my plan was. And I think Jerry's plan was that, you know, he was probably going to get an MFA and either do like commercial art, because he was very good at graphics, or, you know, or teach. I think that was, you know, that was the plan. But all of a sudden, like, the college is closed, and once you get shot at college, it makes you a little leery about the process. So we were both angry, and we were becoming increasingly aware of some of the basic problems intrinsic with humanity. And that is that, well, we all know that chimpanzees and humans share about 98.5% of their DNA. And when you start studying chimps, you find out chimps are pretty mean. They commit premeditated murder. They, when meat's available, they'll eat up to a half a pound of meat a day. And if they have surplus meat, they'll trade the surplus meat for sexual or political favors within the chimpanzee group. So it's a lot like Washington, D.C. The problem is, one particular relative of the chimps maybe got too smart for their own good. Mm-hmm. Because once you got the opposable thumbs and a predictive mind, and you start to develop weapons. Now, there's a very interesting book called The Parable of the Tribes, which talks about how when primitive peoples come in contact with each other and there's conflict, and if one wins, then the other has to go into like a weapons technology thing. You know, first they were throwing stones at each other. Well, then they sharp sticks. Then somebody figured out how to have a bow and arrow. And, once you get to that point, I mean, that was good for a couple thousand years. Until, of course, well, the Chinese invent gunpowder and they use it essentially for fireworks. Now, they eventually used some cannon, but that was mostly for defense because China was not interested in expanding. But then you get Western culture comes and says, hey, what is this stuff? Oh, this is cool because, if I take some gunpowder and some pieces of lead, I can shoot a projectile. So they hop on their ships and they sail all over the world, and every place they land, they do armed robbery on the indigenous people. They take over South America. They take over North America. They take over Australia. They take over Tasmania. In Tasmania, they hunted the entire population to extinction. So anyway, so keeping this in mind, now, I have to do a little aside. I had this, I was trying to figure out what to do my master's thesis on. And my advisor, Dr. White, she was an anthropology professor. I said I wanted to do something about Neanderthal because something fascinated me about who they were and what happened to them. And she said, that's a dead story. Don't even bother. You don't want to. She wanted me to do more like social anthropology. I was more interested in physical anthropology. And of course, since then, we found out that not only is Neanderthals not a dead story, but if you're of European extraction, you may be walking around with up to 4% of Neanderthal DNA in your body.
Yeah, the story was a little more complex than they thought it was.
Yes. And then they find the Denisovans that are kind of related to Neanderthal, but they're over in like East Asia and Malaysia, and nobody really knows what the story on them is either. So there's still a lot of, stuff to be filled in. Anyway, about the same time that this is going on, this is, after Kent State, there's this group called the Club of Rome. And they commissioned a study on what expanding human population and capitalism was likely to do to the only planet that we have. So this is I think it was 1970, and the study came out in 1971. Basically, it was pretty pessimistic about, because unless humans were able to control themselves, something which we've never been outstandingly good at. That there could be problems. Now, there was, an immediate intellectual backlash against them. They said, well, your numbers are fudged and, you kind of, it won't be this bad. We'll probably come up with solutions. But if you go back and look at the report, yes, they weren't right about everything. They didn't predict the internet, for example, and some stuff like that. But what they did say is that if you don't control human population, there's simply not going to be enough resources on the planet for every human to have a Honda and a home in the suburbs with a swimming pool.
Right.
There's not enough to go around. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I see now where like, Elon Musk has got all these projects, and he's a smart guy, but he's not as smart as he thinks he is. And the other thing is, he's a bit of a sociopath. In fact, about a month ago, he basically said that because he wants lithium for his batteries. If the cheaper the batteries, the more Tesla systems, either home systems or cars or planes or whatever, he can sell. So, I mean, he basically said that he's prepared to have a coup within, because Peru and Bolivia, the Andes, is where most of the lithium is. Mm-hmm. And he's basically saying, hey, if we have to overthrow some democratic governments in order to get the lithium, that's the cost of doing business.
'Twas always thus.
Yes, exactly. So, and so Jerry and I, and we're being fed information by mentors like Berthoff and Ed Dorn and Eric Mottram and Charles Swanson. In fact, let me tell you this one story about Charles Swanson. He's the art historian guy who was down at Black Mountain. He he's got a recording that he made on a wire recorder at Black Mountain of Bucky Fuller's class singing "Roam Home to Your Dome" to the tune of "Home on the Range." So this is the kind of stuff he was able to like bring to us.
Nice.
But he goes to this art history and museum curator convention in Denver. And he's gone for about a week, and he comes back and he says, "You're not going to believe this." He says, "Thomas Eakins is going to be the next big thing." I don't know if you're familiar. Thomas Eakins painted pictures of guys rowing boats on the Charles River in Boston.
Yeah. He was on a US, he was on a postage, an 8-cent postage stamp, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So Charles Eakins, he said, that's going to be the next big thing. And he said he was at these meetings where basically the art historians were saying they were going to write articles about Eakins. And then the curators, before the articles came out, were going to go around and scour the US for any Eakins that were for sale.
Ah, so you're saying the art world is a fix.
Yes.
Good to know.
Yes, it can be. So then, of course, all the articles, and then museums would have retrospective shows, and the price of Eakins would skyrocket, and everybody, everybody's doing good because, art for the sake of the artists, right?
Yeah, right. Ars gratia artis, I think.
Exactly. So that's the situation. And so then Jerry and I start doing critical examination of American culture. I mean, world culture, but at the time, America was the driving force for world culture too. Sure. It may switch to China, but the U.S. is still probably the intellectual dynamo in that sense.
And culturally, certainly.
Yeah.
Certainly culturally.
So, so we're, and what we decided after reading this Club of Rome report is that we didn't realize it, and in my mind, 1967 is actually the peak year for the United States. I think that's the time when there was actually the most disposable income, and the middle class was the best off it had ever been. And that since that time, because immediately after World War II, our manufacturing base had no competition. All the factories in Japan had been blown up. All the factories in Germany had been blown up. So we were the economic engine for the world. And so they could build shitty cars. Nobody else is building cars. You could buy a Mercedes, but they're crazy expensive. And, and then of course, Japanese cars start coming over, and lo and behold, once they figured out how to make them not rust, they work real good. As a matter of fact, they were they forced American manufacturers to build better cars.
Right. A Corvair wouldn't necessarily stack up against a Honda.
Right. Stuff like that. So then, and in Mottram's class, there were a couple of readings he assigned that were on devolution, but in the sense of political devolution, like where in the United Kingdom, for example, when Scotland started to separate and the power of the monarchy and parliament devolved to the local entities. And we found that kind of interest because it was decentralization of power and authority, kind of going back to the people. And then, of course, we came across the magazine, the Wonder Woman magazine that had the de-evolution machine. And I mean,
most contentious issue of Wonder Woman ever published.
I'm sure it was, right. So, and then it was like, oh man, the light bulb went on completely, because I mean, it's not necessarily that you believe in de-evolution per se, but it becomes just a way to analyze and critique and look at society and what's going on. And once you adopt that, it becomes pretty easy to like deconstruct and find flaws in the system and things to complain about. And let's face it, Devo is complainers.
And they're very good at it. Very good.
Yeah. So, and we applied that in a number of arts. We had the phony ad campaign for cheek to cheek anal deodorant spray, and just anything that crossed our range of vision, we could apply the de-evolutionary analysis to.
Mm-hmm.
And then we started doing some crude music with Jerry and me and Peter Gregg. And that's when like I've Been Refused and I Need a Chick and Private Secretary and Beehive and some stuff like that. And then Bertov suggested that maybe we should do something for the Creative Arts Festival. So that's when we kind of hooked up with Mark, because Mark was never really a full-time student, because he didn't have to be, because he had the, I was born blind thing. So he was not going to be drafted. So he was kind of a part-time student, and he didn't spend much time on campus because they had a couple buildings in downtown Kent, right on the Water Street Strip, where all the bars and clubs were, for printmaking and stuff like that. So he actually spent a lot of time down there. And so, we put together a show. Mark had equipment, and from then on, things just kind of snowballed.
To coin a phrase.
Yes.
So that's an awful lot of background and a lot of intellectual content for the construct. But it leaves one question unanswered. What strange force was it that drew you and Jerry together in the first place?
Well, okay. There was, at Kent, there was this building, the Student Union. And if you walked in the Student Union, immediately to your right was what was called the Hub. And it was like kind of a giant malt shop. And that's where kind of like the frat guys went. And then below the Hub, in the basement, there was, kind of a lunchroom with vending machines. And that's where like the commuting students would sit down there and smoke cigarettes and play bridge during, play cards and stuff like that. But then there was a place called the Commuters Cafeteria. And it opened about 6 o'clock in the morning and stayed open till around 4. So if you were, if you wanted to get a cup of coffee and you didn't want to hang out with the frats, you would go back into the Commuters Cafeteria. And just out of some kind of custom, there were about 2 or 3 tables in one area where kind of all the artsy people, or the people from anthropology or psychology or the English department, they would all kind of meet there and hang out. Because, if you got coffee, you'd sit in that kind of quadrant. And I mean, it was a crazy array of interesting and talented people. And so I started in the fall of 65, fall of 66, Jerry started. And Bobby Watson, the Devo photographer, she also started in 1966. And she and Jerry enrolled the same day, and they were both in the Honors College. And they had a couple courses together, including one with Dr. Hoffman, who was a pretty high-level philosophy prof. He had studied under Sidney Hook at Columbia or NYU. So, he was kind of a big-time intellectual. And so Bobby would come into the Commuters Cafeteria, and she brought Jerry along. And, that we just kind of met each other about a third of the way through the the school year. So we knew each other from, like, I'd say late 1966 on.
Wow. So Bobby Watson, once again, is one of those key players who really nobody ever knew about until the publication of Jay Dellinger's excellent book, We Are Devo, in which you guys were able to get a voice and a representation, which was really, really cool. So what was it that you brought to the table musically? Like, you played guitar. What was it that made you start to play guitar, and what was it you were playing?
Well, I started playing guitar in high school, mostly like folk and blues, acoustic for the most part. And but then in about I think it was probably 69, I got a Telecaster and started playing electric a little bit. I'm not a musician. I'm a, I can pick a little guitar and I can pick some stuff out on piano, but I don't know much musical theory. And I think my contributions were more significant in other ways than guitar, but I was able to come up with some simple, catchy stuff. I think, like like Be Stiff, Can You Take It, the Rope Song, early stuff like that.
Yeah, which was the first time I ever saw the credit B. Lewis on a record label, and I this goes right back to the first album. It's like B. Lewis. Well, there's Mother's Balls and Casales or whatever it was, but B. Lewis, that's interesting. And P. Greg, it's like, who are these? What are these? I don't even know what that meant. So, who was and what did they bring to the table? General Jacket and Peter Gregg and those guys.
Well, Peter Gregg, he was an interesting story. He was one of 5 boys, and they lived in Twin Lakes, which is right next to Kent. And so he was a townie. He was a townie kid, and he was quite a bit younger than we were. And I think when he was 13, his dad dropped dead on the golf course, and then about 3 years later, his mom died. She had had a stroke and she died. So he was basically on his own. And the kind of hippie community in Kent kind of adopted him. Walsh let him be like a roadie and hang out with him. And he was a really good dancer, but he also, although he didn't know much music theory, he was able to come up with really kind of nasty licks, and he learned some guitar from Walsh. Walsh taught him some basic stuff. You kind of Funk 49 stuff.
Yeah.
And so Peter and Jerry would jam, and they were able to interact really pretty well with musically, because Jerry would lay down a funky beat and then Peter could do stuff over top, and then sometimes I would play slide along with them.
Because
that's what those really earliest recording are. Jerry's got an acetate somewhere that's got, I think it's 3 or 4 of those real early recordings on it.
Right on. And even that early, the Devo aesthetic was informing your music?
Well, I think to the extent that, there were bands like Yes and stuff like that were just like so big and complicated, and everybody had to take a big solo, and everybody had, and it was kind of a desire for simplification, I think.
Yeah, which you guys definitely achieved, because when you start getting into the more like some of the later stuff pre-first album, but this gigantic plethora of demos is documented officially on the, say, the hardcore releases, it sounds like, for lack of any sort of a better term, normal music, but completely fragmented, kind of like what Picasso was doing visually, you guys were doing musically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that's intentional, and I mean, I think maybe the best example is what they did to Satisfaction.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. And that takes a lot of wrapping one heads around to get, but it's instantly catchy.
And then, of course, I mean, the thing that Mark added was Mark was so incredibly facile. You know, he could play anything, and you know, I think there are criticisms that you could make of Mark's music, in that sometimes it's hard to find anything with like real human emotion or soul, but he's so facile and so talented and quick to come up with stuff, and I didn't necessarily realize it at first, but you know, he was always like fascinated with cartoon soundtrack and stuff like that, you know, and so he was able to bring that whole kind of zany, like almost like Spike Jones or Marx Brothers kind of atmosphere into the music.
Yeah, well, the first thing I think of when you talk about it is Fraulein, where they liberally borrow from Raymond Scott and his sort of cartoon music and lay it over this completely devolved story of a gas station attendant. You know, that's I would imagine that's the kind of music, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the idea and the feel for that song originated in Kent, but that layer of what you're saying, that sort of cartoon zaniness, came from Akron.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's fair.
So, and the one thing you said when you did a massive Q&A session at the devotional Devo fan gathering a few years ago, and what you just kind of reiterated now, you were very clear on the fact that Devo originated in Kent. And what you've spoken of today centers around basically Kent State University. Whenever Mark has talked about Devo as being an Akron band, he always talks about the city of Akron and the environs of Akron. And that's sort of a yin and yang kind of thing. Did the town of Kent, the city of Kent, have anything to add to the stew of Devo?
Well, there wasn't really a venue in Kent yet for what Devo was trying to do, and there was in Akron because the guy from the Rubber City Rebels was operating the Crypt, and then there was also a couple places in Cleveland where we could play, and then also in Cleveland there was a guy, John Thompson, who had Hideo's Discodrome. He had this record store. Now, he's the Thompson from TRW. Thompson, Ramo, and Woolrich.
Don't know what that is.
TRW, the giant corporation. They make aircraft engines and all sorts of stuff like that.
Okay, that's why I don't know. I don't function in that world. So.
Oh, okay, yeah. So he was a rich kid. And he had this. Now he also was working with Crocus Behemoth, Dave Thomas from Perubu. In fact, they were living. They had a house together in Cleveland Heights, and he still does some artwork on like Ubu projects. But he was also very helpful in getting us gigs in Cleveland. At the Fantasy Lounge on the West Side, which was this crazy bar that had like, it was like a pirate themed bar, and they had like you'd sit in like booths that were like pirate ships. I
Yeah, it
mean,
had the giant prow of a ship. It's still there.
yeah, yeah.
They're
Oh,
still
yeah.
doing
Okay. Yeah.
it.
And he was also behind one of the shows at the WHK Auditorium,
Right.
not the infamous uh, Halloween show, uh, but another show that actually where we were actually fairly well received.
Yeah, that was like sort of a, for lack of a better term, sort of a homecoming gig for
Right.
Devo after having been to LA and New York and taken both towns by storm. This was their big show in Clevo.
Yeah, and you know, and then Jerry went to New York, and he went to talk to CBGB's and Max's Kansas City, and he lined up a couple spots there. So we went up there, and what I found interesting is the first night we played at CBGB's, and CBGB's Devo really wasn't like dumb enough for them.
Where's the Dead Boys? We're just perfect. Just saying.
Yeah, exactly. But the people at Max's, it was because now John Thompson knew some kids who went to Hampshire College, you know, and he had told them about Devo, and I think maybe they already had gotten the first Devo single, because as we're loading equipment into Max's, and this is in the afternoon, a late afternoon, this flat black spray painted Oldsmobile 98 comes driving up, and on the hood somebody has painted a white bougie boy face. And I mean, how they knew about that, you know, it's I think it's because they'd seen, you know, he was on that first the cover of the first single.
Yeah.
So so there were already people that were kind of excited. They already knew that Devo was coming, and Max was really the crowd there loved it. They got it, and so we were really happy to play there. I think we played there like 4 different trips. The second time, I remember we had the single out, so we took 5,000 copies of the single to sell to Stiff Records, and then we would also drop singles off at Bleecker Bob's record store.
Oh yes, the infamous Bleecker Bob's.
Yeah. And that actually, that's where my favorite story of like New York hip people. So we go down to Bleecker Bob's, and we leave him some records. And as we're walking out of Bleecker Bob's, and I think this was Bob Mothersbaugh and me, and I don't know who, I don't know if Mark or not. I don't think so. But anyway, here comes Debbie Harry and Chris Stein are walking down the street, and they have their arms are full of groceries. So being from the Midwest, we say, hey, you know, you need some help. So we help them carry the groceries back to their apartment. Well, they're in the middle of this frenzied cleanup of the apartment. And I'm what's going on? And so Debbie says, well, Chris's mom is coming to visit this weekend, and she doesn't know we live together. Oh. So this is like the queen of punk rock at this time. And they have to extirpate any trace of a female inhabitancy in the apartment, and I just thought that was just like too perfect.
That's great. That's great. And just to show the people why and how it is you ran into them, you were schlepping by hand personally copies of the first Devo record, Jocko Homo, backed with Mongoloid, with the aforementioned Boogie Boy himself. There he is. And this is a very proud possession of yours, truly, because this is the actual, and I don't know if my cheap ass camera can see it, but this has the black dot adhesive label on the bottom.
Yes. So we had to hand do those. And first, in order to do them, first we had to drive to Queen City Records in Cincinnati with a U-Haul trailer and fill that with the boxes of the singles in a white sleeve. And then we had to go to McKinnon Printing in Cauga Falls, and we had the covers printed 2 up. And I still have about 4 of those where it's the, as it came off the press. And then they would cut them for us, but then we had to fold them, and then we had to put the black Avery black dots on.
Yeah, just to hold it together.
Like 15,000 times we did that.
How many?
15,000. We sold 15,000 copies.
Oh man, and the reason being, yes, it's folded out like this, but then like if you try to stick a record, there's nowhere for it to go and no way for it to stay in. So you had to fold it, stick the dot on the bottom and on the top as well.
Yes, right, because you're right. It might be upside down.
To hold the record into the sleeve. Now that's Devo.
It was Devo.
That's great. That's so DIY,
And we were also selling records in Europe. There was a place in France on the Rue Saint Sulpice. There was a place in Germany, a place in Holland, a place in England. But this is before the internet, kids. So I would go to my parents' house to make the phone call because I have to get on the phone to the guy in France. And it'd be like $7 to make a phone call, and a pack of cigarettes is 50 cents.
Right.
To make this phone call to say, how many do you want and stuff like that. but that was really kind of fun.
Yeah, definitely. And that's another example of the sort of team that you need to have in place in order to make something like that work. Mom and dad are going to pay the phone bill. Someone's got to drive the U-Haul, and someone's got to schlep the records from door to door, literally.
And of course, that's how we came to the attention of David Bowie, was because he was playing in Cleveland. And if at that time, if you were a rock and roller, you stayed at Jim Swingo's Keg and Quarter, which was a bar, restaurant, and hotel on the east side of Cleveland. And that's where, so Bowie came into town. I think this is when he was playing with Iggy Pop.
Yeah.
And so after the show, Susan at the time, Mazzaro, now Susan Aylward, who's married to Michael Aylward, who was in Tin Huey, she and Bob Mothersbaugh drove up and sat in the lobby. And when David Bowie came through, she made sure she put it in his hands. And then, of course, Bowie throws it into this tub that they throw all the demos they don't want to listen to that people give them. And Iggy, when they're on tour, Iggy's going through it and he finds this one and plays it. And he goes, hey, I kind of like this.
Yeah.
And,
see, now that's right on. And that's another, there's so much to talk about. That brings in something that's always been kind of a mystery to me and serious fans of the band Devo, is the nature of the demos, because Devo had a voluminous recorded output prior to the first Warner Brothers album, and even prior to the original singles, the aforementioned Jocko Homo and Satisfaction and Be Stiff. These 45s were how the Cognoscenti first heard about Devo, and then of course Are We Not Men? But Devo cranked out at least 3, maybe 4 full-length albums worth of material in the studio. What's the story behind that? What was the function? What was the structure?
Well, there were basically, I'd say there were four different forms of demo stuff. One was the crudest, and that would be recordings that were made at Devo House on Greenwood during rehearsals. So some of that stuff got recorded. Mm-hmm. And then there was a recording studio in Akron called Krieger Field Recording Studio. And there was a guy named Rick, and Rick, I'm sorry, I can't remember his last name. He was a classically trained, played violin and I think maybe cello. He also played guitar, and so we did, and that was cheap recording, like I don't know, maybe like $20 an hour or something like that. And we recorded a lot of stuff there, including a demo tape that Mark and Jerry wound up driving to California, and they kind of shopped it around. They went to see Joe Walsh and to see if, because I had known Joe and he was, he would always listen to stuff and was generous with advice. But and then there was a recording studio in Cleveland on, I'm trying to think of I can't think of but they had a nice, I think it was a 32 track studio. And that's where the best of the demos were recorded. What do I know for sure was recorded there? I'm a Mechanical Man was recorded there. Yeah. Blockhead, Social Fools was recorded there. I think the first recordings of Smart Patrol there.
Yeah, that's fantastic stuff. That gets back to the analogy I used earlier. That's literally like music that had never been heard before on planet Earth. It really sounds like it comes from another planet, a rather spooky, scary planet. I love it. Love that.
Well, and the weird thing was when we would be in the studio, I cannot tell you how many times where we would say, well, what we want to do is do this. And then the engineers would tell us, oh no, well, you can't do that.
Yeah.
And then of course they would have reasons why, but we didn't want to hear their reasons why we couldn't do it. We wanted George Martin to be there and figure out a way to do it.
Yeah, someone who will say, well, why don't we try? Well, you want that? Well, maybe we can do it this way or that way, not somebody in a white lab coat saying it's impossible.
Right. No, we can't do that. Well, you can't do that because if you try to do that, then you're gonna, it's gonna be out of phase, and this isn't gonna. And we're like, eh.
Yeah, no, that's the whole point, because these early recordings, and I'm not hyping any product, but the early collections, the Hardcore Devo Volume 1 and Volume 2, and from when I was getting into the band initially, the only way to hear this stuff was on these really arcane bootleg LPs.
Right.
Which is why I was always very curious about the distribution of these demos, because each one of these has almost an entire LP's worth of studio material. And I recall, and I hope was it Eddie Barger or Barger? How do you pronounce his name?
Eddie Barger.
Barger, okay.
Yeah, and he and Marty Raymond, they financed a lot of the early equipment that Mark had, and they had Marty had a car wash. His family was well off. They were they owned or partially owned one of the shops in Akron that made tire molds. There were basically three companies: Acro Mold, McNeil Machine, and one other. And so they would make all the molds for all the rubber companies. And so Marty had some money, and he owned a car wash, the kind where you put the quarters in and spray them.
Yeah.
So behind that car wash, they built like this concrete block building on a slab, and the heating system, because it was on a slab, the heat came out of the ceiling. Well, in cold weather, that's really not the most functional way to heat a room, because all the heat stays, 8 feet up in the air, and your feet are freezing.
Yeah, hot air rises, cold air sinks.
Yeah, you're standing on cold concrete. But anyway, so they put a recording, a small recording studio in there, and now Eddie was our sound guy from the first performance to I would say maybe like 1979 or something like that, when they kind of yeah, it was time for
Yeah.
Eddie to go.
The famous slash infamous New Year's Eve gig in Long Beach, 1979 to 1980.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Night of
So
Long Knives.
yeah, and the general was out there doing some lights for him at the time too. Then he wound up doing he he did the he did this one van for the Eagles. He did this van where he was an airbrush artist. So he painted this van for the Eagles that on the left side of the van was the Pacific Ocean with aircraft carriers on it. And taking off on the aircraft carriers were these giant mechanical pterodactyls. And then they flew around the back of the van. And then on the right side of the van, they descended on Los Angeles and were destroying Los Angeles with lasers coming out of their eyes.
Nice.
It actually upset people on the street in LA. They'd go, what's with this?
Love it.
And of course, the general was in California, living in San Clemente, and
Wait, this is General Jacket. We should clarify that. General Jacket.
General Jacket. And so in the summer of 1972, Jerry and his girlfriend Cora and Bobby Watson and I went out to California and stayed with the general in San Clemente. And then we would go into LA to work on the LA staff. And that's when we did a couple articles about Devo in the LA staff. We also did an article on Orange County Dragway called "The Drags Are a Drag." And then we did this interview with Ricky Nelson, who had just released Garden Party, because he had played Madison Square Garden, and we started to play new music. The crowd booed him. The kid had never been booed. The first live gig he ever played was in front of 40,000 people. And so he'd never been booed before, and it really hurt his feelings. And so, and so Jerry and I interviewed him. He was like perhaps the nicest human being I've ever met. He had a house down in Laguna, and where he and the Stone Canyon Band would play. And he said, hey, come on up from San Clemente and jam and stuff. Like, he was really nice. So anyway, we had a good summer, and we did get some Devo stuff done.
Right on. And then that sort of backtracks a little bit to the fact that there is so much Devo history and Devo backstory before you guys even recorded a note of music, before anybody knew who Mark Mothersbaugh was or met him or them or anybody from Akron at all. And I think this is a real good time to take a break, because we've been at it for an hour already.
Yes.
And we've probably scratched the surface a little bit, but I think there's a little more digging to do. So if you're game, I'd like to come back in a little while and continue the story.
Yeah, I would like to do that, but I don't know if I can do another hour tonight. So if we could
That's perfectly fine. Through the wonders of technology, we can make it happen whenever and wherever we want to. So
okay.
We're going to do it.
I got this dog over here. Where's the dog?
Oh, there's the dog.
That dog wants to go outside. So
yeah,
it's been really fun. It's been fun talking to you, and we can do it again soon.
Most definitely. So thank you so much for this. All you people out there watching, you just heard it. There's going to be more. So don't even think of not tuning into the next episode of the Malcolm Tent Shoot interview. It's going to have Bob Lewis part 2. So
thank you, Malcolm.
Thank you, Bob. Over and out.
Bye-bye. Okay.